Hi, everyone. I want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our virtual commemoration of the 1790 cabinet dinner hosted on the mansion's ground with President George Washington and his cabinet. I'm Shiloh Holly. I'm the executive director at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And I want to start this evening off by playing a poll to ask how many of you have been to the mansion before. So while we are taking that, I briefly just want to thank our performer, Edward W. Hardy, for the musical selections this afternoon. If you're interested in hearing which pieces those actually were, feel free to take a look at the chat where those are written out for you. Just a few more minutes on this poll. Again, we thank you so much for joining us. And it looks like about 68% of you have been to the mansion before, and 32 people who are you're with us for the first time. So thank you so much for that. So this event serves to mark a cabinet dinner hosted by President George Washington, which was an alfresco affair held on the mansion's ground 230 years ago on the second Sunday in July. This program is a way for us to explore various aspects of this special event, such as the mansion's architecture, components to the meal, implements and china used to present and eat it, and those who gathered at the meal. As the mansion has continued to implement its reinterpretation plan over the past 5 years, many revelations have come to light during our research and investigation. Importantly, it has been discovered that this dinner, which was previously thought to be held in the mansion's dining room, was held outdoors, both because the dining room was too small to accommodate the many guests, but also because it was held in the middle of the summer and it was more fashionable and comfortable for a dining al fresco. So this afternoon, we hope to present the historical events that took place on this special evening held in 1790 by sharing new components of them. We're going to have conversations with our three presenters to dig into these topics a little bit more. And as we continue our work to bring history alive at Manhattan's oldest house, the mansion plans to offer new perspectives on this period to further explore the relationship to the past and contemporary artistic and social narratives. And with that, I'd like to just briefly introduce to you two special projects that we are getting ready to undertake at the mansion. Funding from Humanities New York will allow us to better explore the histories of the enslaved individuals of the Morris family, William Lee, who was George Washington's enslaved valet who served with him during the Revolutionary War and was likely at the mansion, and Anne Northrop, who was the wife of Solomon Northrop of 12 Years a Slave, who Anne and her children actually lived at the mansion while she was serving as a cook for the Jumel family. And coincidence has it that on July 10th, which was the date of the original dinner in 1790, that date also shares a birthday with Solomon Northrop, who would have been 212 on Friday. And additionally, I'm pleased to announce that the New York Community Trust has awarded the mansion with a new Arts Capacity Building grant to create an expansive and inclusive interpretation of our 255-year history. And project highlights to come include that all didactic and informational and wayfinding signs will be translated into Spanish. And we will be revamping our school programs to better align with the mansion's reinterpretation plan and develop additional digital content for everyone to enjoy. And while we look forward to opening our doors later this year, it's very exciting that we are able to work on these projects to better serve our community once our doors open back. And with that, I'd like to introduce our president of the Board of Trustees at the Morris-Jumel Mansion, Lisa Konigsberg, who's going to tell you a little bit more. Lisa, feel free to take it away.
Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be spending this afternoon with you, and we're so delighted to virtually welcome you to the mansion. We cannot wait to see you in person. This event each year is very important for the mansion, and so we're particularly grateful to be able to do this in a very modern fashion to introduce you or refamiliarize those of you who know with our past. Now, each segment of this afternoon's program will be hosted by a different mansion representative who will then share a bit more about our current initiatives, those that we plan to undertake this year. And for us, that's 2020-2021. In prior years, the event, as Shiloh mentioned, has been an outdoor dinner, and it has served as the mansion's primary fundraiser. Funds generated provided support for our educational programming, and we are Manhattan's oldest house. We invite you to donate today by texting MJM to 44-321 or by visiting the link in the chat. Any gifts received today over $50 will be entered to win one of the special items from our gift shop relating to the Harlem Renaissance, 18th century culinary arts, and an autographed copy of The Cabinet, the author of which, Lindsay Chervinsky, will be speaking today, and of course other Washington-related items. Please know how meaningful any support that you wish to give would be to us, both as a sign of your involvement and, of course, a contribution that will make a difference to the work that we undertake every day, whether our physical doors are open or not. We are communicating with our constituencies on a daily basis, and we would be very grateful for your support. Having said that, we are delighted to have you with us this afternoon, and hope very much that you enjoy what we think will be an interesting and delightful and informative program. And with that, I pass the mic, as we say, back to Shiloh for some housekeeping details and to introduce our first speaker. So thank you, everybody. See you shortly.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So just a quick update on some technical questions and how to navigate during the webinar today. So there's several different functions. You'll see on the bottom left, there's a chat icon where you can submit any technical questions or comments. We have some moderators who will be attending to the chat throughout this afternoon's program. Also, there is a raise your hand function in the middle. And that will allow us to communicate with you if you have any additional questions or need any technical support. And the third option is submit a question through the Q&A. This will be visible for all participants. And also, if you have a question for one of our presenters, our moderators will filter that question on to the person leading the conversation at the end of the presentation. So these are three ways that we will be continuing to communicate throughout tonight's program. And then if also this event is going to be recorded. So if you are not comfortable being on camera, here are some additional instructions on how to stop your video. So you can turn your camera off using the Zoom menu bar, or exit the meeting if you're not comfortable with being recorded. So this icon is at the bottom left. Sometimes you have to hover over it for it to actually pop up. And by remaining in video function and in the webinar, you're granting your consent to be recorded this afternoon. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Richard Guy Wilson, who is an architecture historian who will be delivering our first talk of the afternoon, focusing on the setting of Washington's cabinet dinner, which was the Morris-Jumel Mansion, and its connection to Palladian architecture. So Richard Guy Wilson held the Commonwealth Chair in Architecture at the University of Virginia, where he taught from 1976 to 2019. He is a frequent lecturer for universities, museums, and professional groups, and a television commentator. He curated numerous exhibitions on the American Renaissance, the arts and crafts movement, and Thomas Jefferson. He has published many articles and books, including The American Renaissance, The Colonial Revival House, Edith Wharton at Home, among others. He has led the Victorian Society's 19th Century Summer School for 39 years, and he has received UVA's Outstanding Professor Award in 2001. He was made a Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians in 2019, and also formerly an award recipient of the Morris-Jumel Mansion in 2009. And with that, I welcome Richard Guy Wilson, who is going to share his screen with us. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the Palladian architecture and its relation to the mansion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we pull up my images or? Good. There we go. I can be heard okay?
We can hear you great, Richard, and just let me know when you're ready to change the slide.
Okay, well, we'll start off right here. And as you can see, I hope you read very closely. The cookbook that they're looking at there is the 4 books of architecture by Andrea Palladio. And what I want to talk about is the relationship of the Morris-Jumel. We can go ahead to the next image, please. Do I push it or? Talk about the relationship of the Morris-Jumel Mansion to American architecture, and in particular, Andrea Palladio. Of course, there's many things that can be said about the house, and of course, the events that took place there, including what we're celebrating today. But it also is, in another level, a very interesting house in American architecture because and a lot of the focus is going to be on that big portico that you see there, because it is one of the earliest in American houses. And I'm showing you this comparison right here, a house outside of Philadelphia, which unbelievably is sometimes said that this is the first house that had such a portico. Well, they haven't bothered to look around a little bit and to see that the Morris-Jumel actually had this. Can we have the next, please? The influence of Palladio on American architecture is very extensive, and I could spend a couple of hours here just talking about that. But just to show you some other examples that are spread around, down in South Carolina, Drayton Hall, which is one of the earliest examples. And then, of course, well, I taught at his university for many years, but Monticello by Thomas Jefferson is also an excellent example of the impact of Andrea Palladio. Next, please. Okay, so Andrea Palladio. Here are 2 images of him. One that appeared inside of a book that he published, or 4 books that he published, I'll come back to in a minute. On the left, this is a bust that is in Vicenza in Italy. And exactly what we look like, not quite sure, but he is undoubtedly one of the greatest Western architects there has been. One of the great Italian architects, part of the Italian Renaissance, and he really helped to change the course of architecture in the American West by looking back to the classic, looking back to the Roman and to some degree to the Greek past. Can we have the next slide, please? If you go to either Venice, where he did practice for many years, and if you get off at the Palazzo San Marco and you look across the bay, you will see what we see there on the right, San Giorgio Maggiore. This is one of several churches that he did design in Venice, and there's a lot of other. And again, I could probably spend a couple of hours just talking about him in Venice. But also he came from Vicenza, which is a little distance from Venice. And there he also designed a number of very important buildings, including this huge basilica, which is downtown on the major square. And as you can see, it is a very major sort of a building. Next, please. But also, no, go back. Or can I do this myself? Okay. Anyway, also what he is very well known for, and perhaps one of his biggest influences outside of Italy, was a series of villas that he built for very wealthy individuals who had very large farms or plantations, whatever you might call them, out in the Veneto. And one of the striking things about these houses or these farms is the way that he connects the outbuildings, as you can see in the wings that are stretching out. But then, of course, there in the center, you have these large porticos with big columns, a big pediment. Next, please. This is probably the most famous building of his of all time, and it sits on a hill just outside of Venice. And actually, it was not a farm villa, it was a party house for the Valmarana family. It has two different names, but it has these 4 facades, which are on all sides of it. And as you can see, this dome on the center. And this is probably the building that he is best known for and that one wants to go visit whenever you are there in Venice. Next, please. As I mentioned a minute ago, and this is very, very important with any architect, how is it that people are going to know about your work? And of course, this is before the internet and before mass publication, but he published a book, or 4 books as it was called, the Quattro Libre, the 4 books of architecture. And they are large folio-sized volumes. On the inside of them, you had these very detailed sorts of plans and an elevation of the different buildings. The ones I just been showing you, but here also of this villa. Next, please. It was such a popular book that it was picked up and translated both into French and into English. And there are several different English editions of it, but probably the best known of them is this one here by Giacomo Leoni, or he changed his name to James Leoni. He migrated up to England in the very early 18th century, and he published the 4 volumes. These were very, very expensive. And once again, they are folio-sized volumes. By the price today, they were probably about $2,000 to $3,000 for purchasing them. And you have to keep in mind that also how you'd get these books. You didn't have Amazon to deliver to you every day or go down to Barnes and Noble. They had to be shipped. Also in these books, he taught you how to do architecture. And of course, these are some of the drawing instruments, which today are totally forgotten, I think, by most people that are in architecture schools. Next, please. And in the volume were the different villas and so forth. And as I say, Palladio does have a very, very big influence, but it is really the villas that are pictured in both his original books and then in the Leoni edition and other people's editions. It really spreads throughout the world. Next, please. And just to go and say what happens, he begins to pop up in England in the very early 17th century, with here in London. This is the Royal Banqueting Hall designed by Inigo Jones, and this was for the royal family, and this is where big parties would take place. If you go to London today, you can visit it. And then about a century later, he pops up again in this house just a little bit outside of London at Chiswick, which is designed by one of the genuine architectural freaks of all time, Lord Burlington. As you can see, he's picking up on a little bit there of that Villa Capra, or the Villa Rotonda I showed you a minute ago. But he becomes very, very popular in England. Next, please. And indeed, in front of the house on either side, and I should have pointed out, but here on the left, you have a statue of Palladio, and on the right of Inigo Jones. And this just shows, again, in the way in which he is just being revered and so forth as a very, 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 very important figure. Next, please. So anyway, what happens is that, of course, across the big pond, a few of these books, probably the Leoni editions, float across and show up in different places. And there are different buildings and so forth that can be noted on these. The one on the right is Arguably, and I'll be coming back to this in a minute, but this is the Redwood Library in Newport by Peter Harrison. And he was very much of a gentleman architect, but this is a very, very exact reproduction. At the Morris-Jumel house, as you can see on the left, you have the big portico. One of the things that undoubtedly classicist freaks would criticize about the Morris-Jumel is that they made the columns a little bit too thin. But it's very clear that the people that are involved in the design of the Morris-Jumel and the building of it, and very frequently those were together, are being looking at the Palladio books or looking at some reproductions that come out. Next, please. One person who is a real freak of Palladio is Thomas Jefferson. And on the left, I am showing you a drawing by him for Monticello 1. This is the original Monticello. He would later tear this down and rebuild it and put a dome on the top of it. But this is very much something that he is copying right out of his book of Palladio. And Jefferson had probably the largest architectural library here in the American colonies, with about 18 different titles in it. His total library is about 5,600 books, which are a heck of a lot. And once again, you were ordering these things and being shipped across. And another sort of a variation on this is on the right. This is Poplar Forest, his house down outside of Lynchburg, which is sort of a getaway house, but shows the way that he's playing with this. Next, please. One of the things that was very, very important in Palladio, and one of the things that many of the architects and the builders were focused on, were the orders. And he shows you the 5 orders that we're looking at there on the left, the way that they are different, the Tuscan, then the Doric, then the Ionic, then the Corinthian, and then the Composite. And then he goes into these types of details, such as the Ionic columns and so forth. And so Palladio is an impact on both the large scale of the building, but also on the details. Next, please. Once again, back to the Redwood Library, which is arguably the very first library built in this country, or individual library building built in this country. I should say it was a subscription library. It still exists today. It's been much, much, much added to. But the architect here, Peter Harrison, is drawing upon another book, which was an interpretation of Palladio by William Kent. And Mr. Kent was an English architect, and he published his books in architecture. And as you can see, he's picking up on Palladio. And Mr. Harrison over here in Newport is picking up on that, but cutting off the dome. But basically, that's the front of the building. Next, please. So my point is that Palladio is a really, really, really big influence. And indeed, the first public building constructed in this country after the Revolution is down in Richmond, Virginia, designed by, guess who? Thomas Jefferson. This is the Virginia state capitol. We're looking at it on the right. And it is based upon the Maison Carree, which is in Nîmes, which is in southern France, and is one of the best surviving. It's a beautifully preserved Roman temple. The dates sort of vary on this. Some places you see a little bit different dates, but it's right around 4 to 7 AD. And Jefferson is picking up on this, so he's making changes on it. It is after he does the designs of this that he actually goes down to Nîmes and sees this temple, and he says, I am like a lover gazing at his mistress. Can we have the next 2, please? Because the way that he designs the building, he did this while he was off in France, as the American ambassador in France between 1784 to 89, was in Palladio, there was the Maison Carree. And Palladio had put it in, and then Leoni picks it up, and I'm showing you the Leoni front here. And it's not too hard to see that Jefferson has sort of laid a piece of paper over the drawing on the left, or the plate on the left, poked some holes through it, and you can see it in Jefferson's drawings if you hold it up to the light, and is picking that up and is using it as his model for, as I say, this is the very first public building built in this country after the Revolution. Next, please. So to continue on, and of course I could go on for about 10 hours here on this, but the Palladio is a big influence, for instance, on what today is the White House in Washington, D.C. This is the original design for it on the left by Thomas Hoban. Jefferson actually put in his proposal, which Washington apparently looked at and said, no way, Jose, we're not doing that. But this is Jefferson's proposal on the right, as you can see with this dome. But what is very interesting is, and I've done quite a bit of research on the White House over the years, next please, you do have additions that are put on it in time, and the portico is extended out, such as you can see here on both sides. This is the drawing by Benjamin Henry Latrobe on the left, and this is the front entrance on the right. And I should note that the person involved in all of this is Thomas Jefferson. Next, please. Anyway, what we have here is that Morris-Jumel, in the history of American architecture, occupies a very, very important place. It is one of the earliest in which you can see the impact of Palladio, who becomes really the central figure in early American architecture. And this is very much earlier than Jefferson is fooling around up at Monticello, but he never builds anything that looked like the Morris-Jumel Mansion. Next, please. And then just to pop inside for half a minute, because, and just a note, that one of the things that Palladio stresses in his buildings is that you enter in the front and then you process through, that there is procession that passes through the building with some sort of a major interior type of space. And so if we take a look over at the Morris-Jumel on the left, as you can see, the way that you open, you come inside, then you progress on, and then finally this great, and let's have the next slide, please. Here we are. And it's not exactly the same. I'm just picking the Villa Capra or the Villa Rotonda there outside of Venice on the right. But this whole idea that it's not just the exterior, it's the interior and the types of spaces that you create there in this sort of a curvilinear type of shape was something that was undoubtedly very unusual at that point in time here in the American colonies. And once again, it points out the importance of the Morris-Jumel. Next, please. The point is that what we have here is this major impact of this Italian Renaissance architect. And this goes to, I think, the heart of what is going on here in the American colonies and then in the early republic, was the idea we have to establish an architecture. We have to have an architecture that looks back and makes connections with the past. And Palladio, with his very important books and so forth, is very, very important. And so once again, as I said, the Morris-Jumel is, I think, one of the very, very important house in the history of American architecture. Yes, other events took place there. There were dinners on the lawn and so forth, but in another way, it really impacts American architecture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. I have a few questions for you, and if anyone has any questions for Richard, feel free to put them in the chat and we can incorporate them into our conversation. So my first question for you is how that's so incredibly interesting about your findings about the date of the portico and people thinking that, there are other buildings that may have had a similar design, but they were actually later than the mansion. The question for you is, do you know much about the octagon room? Because in our interpretation, we mentioned that the octagonal shape is one of the first implemented in the colonies. Do you know of any earlier buildings with that octagonal design?
I think it's one of the earliest. Yeah, I mean, you have to be careful in these firsties because everything becomes a first, and it just becomes overwhelming. But as I say, I think it is really one of the very, very earliest that you see that. And I mean, the point is that the Morris-Jumel, the people who are up there, Morris and his builders, and we need to know more about them. I just don't know enough about them. Were very, very sophisticated and had some sort of an idea going on about this that is far beyond a lot of other places in the American colonies.
Right. Great. So, with that, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the influence of European architecture in the colonies. As you alluded to, both Colonel Roger Morris's father and uncle were architects in Britain, but at what point does this integration of the European style become an American style?
Well, it becomes an American style right after the Revolution, because as I say, and I should have shown you a picture of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, or I could have showed you the earlier Capitol down in Williamsburg, Virginia, which has been reconstructed. But they look nothing like the Virginia State Capitol that Jefferson designed. And all of a sudden you begin to get these big porticos. And I think that they're coming basically out of Palladio. Yes, some other people that are interpreting, but Palladio is so influential in England. And after all, we are a colony of England, so we pick it up and bring it over here. But then to turn around and put up an entire temple as a state capital says something about what Jefferson had in mind of making this into an American architecture.
Interesting. So you refer to these big parties and events that are happening within the walls of these large houses and large public buildings. Can you talk a little bit more about the exterior and the relation between those social events? And we have a question from Jennifer that dovetails into that. Do you know whether Washington and his cabinet would have been interested and appreciative of the design of the Morris-Jumel Mansion while they were there?
Well, on Washington's ideas, you better wait until I've gone to bed tonight and talk to him and see what he has to say. But I mean, my goodness, I mean, I just couldn't do everything here in the amount of time. Washington was an architectural nut. He spent his entire life building that Mount Vernon. While he was off during the Revolutionary War, he's sending letters back to Martha to have them do this, have them do that, and so forth. And I mean, I could have put in, I mean, Mount Vernon is different than these houses that I'm just showing you of Palladio, but still at the same time, that huge portico that stretches across it. And then on the other side, the approach side, the portico is the face that looks out to the Potomac River. On the other side, you have to be really discriminating because it looks like it's a perfectly symmetrical. But then if you begin to pick around, you can see that the windows don't quite line up and so forth. He has an earlier house that's hidden in there, but he's trying to make it into this symmetrical type thing. And he's using the details that come out of Palladio or out of these English pattern books. And I didn't want to go through all of them, but the coins in the corners that you have in the Morris-Jumel Mansion, the fretwork and so forth, the dentals, they're up there in the entablature and all of that. Washington is doing that as well. And I mean, the point is that, well, there is that weird second president of the United States from Massachusetts, excuse me. I mean, he's a wonderful man, John Adams, but he is a good New England Congregationalist. And he did fool around with his house down in Quincy, Massachusetts, but it is nothing like the other big mansions that are being built, as I say, by Washington and by Jefferson and by Madison and Monroe. And this is very clear that this is a statement that is going on.
So another one of the unique features that we have at the mansion is the serving alcove in the dining room. And not to spend too much time on the interior, but can you talk a little bit more about that and, you know, how that dedicated space may have changed the whole function of the interior with dining service?
Yes, well, actually, Jefferson has that same sort of a thing at his house. And I think what it is well, you want to keep the servants out of sight as much as you can, and at the same time have this wonderful sort of a presentation and so forth. And very clearly, I mean, I've only been to the Morris-Jumel Mansion twice, but it's very clear that what was being set up there is to be this, the procession into the house, the way that you're greeted, the type of details. And I mean, again, I could have gone on and on and on with some of the interior details that you have there, but it's very much intended that this is to impress.
Yeah, that's interesting. So You know, I would just like to conclude and say that obviously our research and scholarship about this building is ongoing, and we thank you so much, Richard, for sharing what you have with us today, and really just tying in a lot of, you know, having that basis of architectural history will really benefit us as we come back to the building and explore it on ourselves, and also for those of us who talk about it on a daily basis. And one quick note, through our Humanities New York project, we're hoping to find out a little bit more about something that you referenced earlier, which was who actually built this house, which, you know, for us, we're actually hoping to investigate whether that was the people enslaved by the Morris family who did that construction, and dig in a little bit more to see if they actually constructed any local public works projects like the Kingsbridge Road, the old Kingsbridge Road in Upper Manhattan. So we look forward to sharing with everyone these findings once we dig in a little bit more this fall and once this project is underway. And that project really serves as the foundation for us to expand our ongoing work on race and social justice issues. And for instance, how the house is connected with Sugar Hill, which was one of the main neighborhoods of the Harlem Renaissance. So we're really excited about that work to come. So this work, much like many other initiatives currently underway at the mansion, isn't possible without your support. Again, we'd like to ask you to donate today by texting MJM to 44312 or by visiting the link in the chat. And any gifts received today over $50 will be entered to win a few special items. And we have a really great Harlem Renaissance package selected from items from our gift shop, including some postcards and images of the area, but also a selection of handmade quilted cards by local artists and our neighbor and friend, Ife Felix. Again, Richard, thank you so much. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our educator, Meg Lynch, who is going to talk a little bit about, as an appetizer, 18th century ice cream before we dig into our next section of the program, which will be about place settings and George Washington's China. So Meg, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Shiloh. Yeah, so a lot of people know about George Washington's supposedly wooden teeth. Fun fact, they were not simply made of wood. In fact, one of the surviving dentures does not contain any wood, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about what his dentures were made of. But it's no surprise that Washington's teeth were not in great shape. He ate lots of ice cream. And 1790 was not just an important year for the United States and the first cabinet dinner, it was also a pretty important year for ice cream. The first ice cream parlor in New York City opened in 1790. And the summer of 1790, George Washington had a $200 bill from a New York merchant. This is not his overall bill for the year. It is simply his bill when he was in New York. And that was a $200 bill. In today's currency, that would be about $5,573 that our first president spent on ice cream that when in New York. But the first mention of ice cream in America occurred in 1744, and it was a journal entry by a guest of the Maryland Governor William Baldwin, who served vanilla ice cream with strawberries, and it was described as a rarity. In fact, it would have been quite rare. Then we also have Hannah Glass, who publishes The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, which far exceeds anything of the kind yet published. Yes, that is the title. And Martha Washington owned a copy of that book as well. And she describes this recipe as requiring 6 ounces of double refined sugar, 4 very accurate handfuls of salt, which you then place in a tub of broken ice, and after it's all froze up, put it into a mold. And here we see the very first advertisement for ice cream. So this was published in May of 1777 in the New York Gazette. But back to George Washington. So he was a huge fan of ice cream, and we have records that he purchased a cream machine for ice in 1784 in Mount Vernon. But it's also, so ice cream has become, while it was existent for quite a while, as far back as Roman Emperor Nero and Alexander the Great, people were taking ice or snow and combining it with either fruit nectar or crushed fruit. So the idea of having a sweet cold treat in the summertime is not novel at all. And in fact, several presidents have embraced ice cream as their favorite treats, not just our first, including James Madison, whose wife Dolly actually served oyster ice cream at the White House during their presidency. So even though it's been around for a while, Americans really improved the taste and texture. And Ronald Reagan, our president, actually declared, our former president declared July National Ice Cream Month. So thank you for joining us today, not just to celebrate the cabinet, but to celebrate National Ice Cream Month. So we already know George Washington ate ice cream, but in general, the people who would have been eating ice cream in the 18th century would have been incredibly wealthy. Why is that? Well, we would have needed access to ice, cream, and all sorts of really expensive raw products, right? So essentially people who lived in houses that looked like this would be eating ice cream, very wealthy people. But who made the ice cream? We talked a little bit about the servants and the serving alcove. So that's who would have made the ice cream. Realistically, the enslaved people that Washington owned would have made his ice cream. So where were they getting their ingredients? So the main ingredients, we were just talking a lot about Jefferson. Jefferson also absolutely loved ice cream, and in 1801 was the French ambassador and was an ambassador over in France and wrote down a recipe and brought it back himself and sort of refined it as well. But in general, the ingredients that we would be using were ice, cream, sugar, salt, and whatever sort of flavoring you desired. So the cream would have come from cows. We would have needed a surplus of cream. So you would have either needed to own an estate or a plantation that was able to produce enough cream to have a surplus to make your ice cream. And you also would have needed a lot of money to import sugar and salt. So sugar cane would not have been grown in the United States at the time. So we're talking a pretty pricey snack way back then. And the ice. So we did not have refrigeration at the time, nor did we have the ability to transport ice cream quickly. So what the enslaved people would have done was go out onto the rivers on the coldest nights of the winter, and they would have cut out chunks of ice from the rivers and stored these massive chunks in ice houses, which would have been somewhat subterranean, or they would have purchased ice from an ice house merchant. And so if anybody has any questions about George Washington, ice cream in general, we would love to address those before we hand it off and progress with the rest of our event. Earlier this afternoon, we also had a live activity where we taught you how to make your very own 18th century ice cream. So if you're interested in that, please head over to our YouTube channel. That should be up there in about 48 hours. And we often offer this activity in person as well. So we hope to see you at one of our future family days when we do open up. Megan, have any questions in the chat?
Anne has a comment that she wanted to share about in the early 19th century, ice cream was the big draw at the public gardens, Vauxhall, Niblo, etc. Granted, there was an admissions charge. And I believe someone earlier had a question if you, are there more details about the merchant in New York City that Washington may have procured his ingredients and ice cream machines from?
My research just said a merchant, and actually as I was researching, I really wanted to figure that out myself. I wasn't able to find that from home, but we can absolutely follow up with you and post that on our additional resources page as we continue our own research. Definitely. And for those of you who are interested in trying it, please head to our YouTube page. All right. So with
Thank you, Meg.
Yeah, thank you, Meg.